Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this LPB News special on former Governor Edwin Edwards. You'll notice we're in the same studio and on the same set where weekly we broadcast SWI, Louisiana, the state we're in. That's because it's here in this very studio that we covered Edwards during his unprecedented 4 terms as governor. One of his most famous debates took place in this studio, and it's from here that viewers first learned of the details of investigations, one after another, that came to dominate his time in office. We have some very special guests tonight, and I'll introduce them to you in just a few minutes. But first, let's take a brief look back at Edwards' career.
You know, for all these years, people who've never met me analyze my character and my life's work. Sometimes about issues on which I've never given an opportunity to tell my story.
In 1995, at the end of Edwin Edwards' 4th term as governor, he addressed the legislature, looking back on his accomplishments.
It made me realize how many people don't have the advantages that we have. And I always had a sympathy for people who were poor, without education, big families, and having to struggle to get on in life.
Governor Edwards did an awful lot for this state. He was one of the most brilliant people that have ever served as governor of Louisiana.
He was handsome, he was very articulate and witty, and he sort of had a roguishness about him that appealed to Louisiana voters.
There was always that attitude there. And talk about power. He had it, he wanted it, and he grabbed it.
He had a big personality that filled the stage in a different kind of way. So people saw in him a dynamic guy who could get things done.
Moi, Edwin Edwards. Moi, Edwin Edwards. Je fais ça de moi. Je fais ça de moi.
The first thing he changed, he revamped the state's constitution.
Before that, there were 200 agencies, departments, and the Constitution made it possible for us to reorganize government to 20 departments, which made it much more responsive to the needs and also very more economical.
I say the biggest accomplishment was that when he changed the taxation of oil and gas from a straight per barrel or per cubic foot to a percentage of value.
And by changing it to a percent of value, then we were able to enjoy the great boon when oil prices went way up.
All 11 of the hospitals were either completely rebuilt by me or modernized and renovated.
Who built the Cajun Dome? Who paved the parking lot at the football stadium? Who's 4-lane in the highway to Abbeville?
He was constitutionally barred from seeking a 3rd term at that time. But a new element of the Constitution, called the jungle primary, paved a way for a Republican to take his seat.
Edwards is, by default, the father of the Republican Party.
I spent a lot of money, and a lot of time, a lot of effort on the long primary until I finally got the Democratic nomination, and then I had to face Dave Treen in a general election, and I thought that was unfair.
The open primary opened everything up, let anybody vote for anybody regardless of party registration.
Edwards beat incumbent Dave Treen to win a 3rd term, but allegations of corruption and the state's mounting money problems due to the oil downturn caught up with him.
There was a lot of corruption or hints of corruption, certainly there was a number of investigations. And it's funny, it started with the suspicion that he was that corruption was funding his gambling habit.
Well, I couldn't do anything about it. I mean, I was a public figure, and members of the press had a right and obligation to investigate, and law enforcement people had the same privilege, and I accepted that.
This indictment results either from mistakes which the Republican U.S. Attorney has made or from mistakes which I have made. We will not know which of us is to blame until the trial has been concluded.
He went to trial and avoided conviction in '86, but in '87, the voters of Louisiana issued their own verdict, electing Governor Buddy Roemer. We know what happened from there. Roemer lost popularity after expanding gaming, and in '91, he failed to make the runoff. Edwards defeated a white supremacist to win a final term, and federal investigators finally won a conviction against Edwards for racketeering and money laundering regarding the gaming expansion.
I think he was simply a throwback to the old way of thinking in our state that the law does not apply to everyone.
History is going to be very cruel to Edwin Edwards. They know Edwards for corruption, they know Edwards for court cases, they know Edwards for glib quotes, they know Edwards for sexual shenanigans, but they don't know him for anything they did to make the state a better place.
Beth Courtney and Bob Courtney covered Louisiana politics during those early and ongoing Edwards years. Now, Beth, of course, became president and CEO of Louisiana Public Broadcasting, which was brand new in the 1970s. Bob, a political reporter for WBRZ TV in Baton Rouge. Beth, what was it like covering a political force like Edwin Edwards?
Well, I always say that it was fortunate for us that LPB signed on in '75, and the first show we did was Louisiana, the state we're in. It was fortunate for us that we had a charismatic governor because people wanted to watch what he was saying, and long stories about issues were watched by the general public. And PBS couldn't believe so many people were interested in politics in Louisiana. And I said, it's because we have a charismatic governor. Mm-hmm.
And one that remembered personal things about people, Bob.
Well, one of my first impressions of Edwin Edwards was that as a young radio reporter, I went to interview him at a function in 1971 when he was first running for governor. Didn't know him from Adam. He didn't know me. I was big fat guy with a tape recorder, and I walked up to him and asked him for an interview. We talked for about 5 minutes, and I went on and did my story. But I encountered him several months later, and he knew me. He knew my name. He recognized me. He came over and spoke to me and asked me how things were at WJBO. I mean, that was pretty startling to me for him to suddenly know who I was.
How does that make you feel?
Well, unfortunately, it made me feel, wow, I like this guy.
Exactly.
Exactly, and that was, I think, the secret to a lot of his personal charismatic success. Was that ability.
And he was able to do that with really pretty much everybody in the state, right?
Absolutely.
Hey, if you were a young woman, he certainly could. So therefore, you actually stayed farther away from him because of that.
It came a point in time, though, that some of the things that helped him be so successful in his first 2 terms, the oil industry, for example, took a downturn. So how different was his strength as a governor once the oil ran out in terms of it being successful?
I think you have to look at Edwin Edwards in there were 2 different eras of his leadership in Louisiana. The first 2 terms were incredibly successful. Edwards passed a new constitution, as you referred to, and did all of these other things, changed the severance tax on oil and natural gas so that we made more money and got a great boom in the economy. And then it was the latter 2 terms where things, not just the investigations, but the whole world changed, the economy changed. Suddenly he didn't have that embarrassment of riches that Representative Kevin Riley one time complained about. And suddenly he couldn't balance the budget very easily. Suddenly he couldn't give pay raises to employees, had to start withholding paychecks and staggering and things like this. Mm-hmm. This was not the kind of world that Edwin Edwards thrived in.
That wasn't his plan.
No.
And there was a point in time where, of course, Dave Treen was governor for 4 years. Edwards always said he would come back, and maybe he was still running things behind the scenes anyway, right, Beth?
Yes, I remember the inauguration of Dave Treen. I kept saying the first Republican since Reconstruction. And we had, there was a shadow government on Airline Highway. Edwards really never gave it up.
No, he didn't.
And that was his camp? That's where he was?
Right.
He bought a house on Airline Highway. It's gone now, but he had a house and some acreage there, and he kept some horses there. And he would have these things where he would invite the media to come out and visit, and he would do interviews at the drop of a hat. You could just call him up about anything. And so, unfortunately, or fortunately for him, we ran to Edwards every time there was a stumble at the mansion, to get his take on it. And it just fed into that ability to kind of run this. I don't think it was a planned shadow government as much as it became kind of that. And it was one of Treen's most difficult things to deal with because Edwards was always out there talking, commenting, and manipulating. Because remember, he still had a great force of people in the administration who he had known and worked with, and also in the legislature.
And how familiar that sounds with what's going on in America today, right?
Absolutely.
Let's take a look at a clip. You both were there at the debate between Edwards and Treen.
I don't think it's realistic to expect local governments, strapped as they already are for financial resources, to bear the burdens of 30% of the tremendous cost of any kind of effective flood program. My own view is that this is a state and a national problem. We should definitely accelerate our efforts to get federal funds, because the Mississippi River is draining something like 41% of the United States east of the Rocky Mountains through Louisiana. We are impacted by that. The rest of the nation benefits from it, and we have a good case to make. Be that as it may, I'm prepared to borrow $100 to $150 million a year as long as I'm governor, to match federal funds or local funds, or to get the program started. We've borrowed over $1.15 billion in the last 3 years and really have little to show for it. $100 million annual borrowing on a 30-year bonded debt would cost the state about $10 million a year to repay. It's a small price to pay when you consider that you'd be removing the serious consequences of floods every 2 years, which have been damaging on the average of $200 to $300 million every 2 years. I think from a standpoint of dollars, and we are coming out well by moving ahead and putting up the money and getting the program done, not counting the loss of lives and the fear that some people have to live in constant threat of flooding. I just don't think it should be permitted or continued. I'm prepared to move.
Do you have any plans to try and control future campaign spending? And would you lobby the legislature to pass appropriate campaign financial limitations?
First, it's not really accurate to say that it's higher here than any other state. In West Virginia, for instance, Jay Rockefeller spent $12 million of his own money in a campaign. It got so bad the bumper stickers for his opponent said, "Make him spend it." And another bumper sticker said, "Spend it, Jay, it's yours." It certainly is obscene, and I regret it very much. That's why I made this serious proposal that nobody took serious back in February. It's silly for us to hustle our friends and supporters and the already oppressed businessmen and women in Louisiana for millions of dollars for these campaigns. We're not going to change by 5% the outcome of this election after spending $8, $9, or $10 or $15 million between the two of us. I never spoke out for a bad environment.
But Governor, many of these polluters that are now polluting the environment are getting that tax exemption.
I got national criticism because I said something that was honest one day. We allowed industry to come to Louisiana for 40 years without being as careful as we should have been. I did that. Governors before me did it. Industry did it. Municipalities did it. We all did it. But it was the truth. Now, we now, in retrospect, see the error of our ways, and what we need to do is to stop it and make certain that industries coming in here can provide employment, use our natural resources, but not pollute our environment. If they cannot do that, then they shouldn't be allowed to come.
Polls also indicate that both of you, very well known, also has some pretty bad negatives. Mr. Edwards, they show that people believe that you do not tell the truth. Mr. Treen, they show that people believe that you're inept. What do each of you have to say to these voters to address these negatives of your own?
I'd rather be inept than dishonest, and I'm not saying that I agree. I'm not saying that I agree with your characterization, but you threw out two adjectives, so if I had to choose one or the other, I would say that.
I'd rather be inept than dishonest also, but since I'm neither, I have a hard time commenting on the question. But it is a problem that I have, a problem that haunts me, and I really don't know what to do about it. I wish I could. I wish everybody in the state could read my heart and read my mind, could listen to my phone conversations and had listened to every word that I've uttered officially since I've been governor. I really try, but when you've been in public life for 28 years and you've been under the intense scrutiny that I have been under, it is difficult to escape that completely because charges come out, investigations are made, allegations are made. It's free speech in this country. I can show you blazing headlines in the Morning Advocate accusing me of all kind of skullduggery that ended up with an apology on the front page the next Sunday. But nevertheless, it's just like throwing a piece of dry dirt at a white wall. It doesn't stick, but it leaves a mark.
So what you heard there, that's an example of a much better answer that Governor Edwards gave than his opponent, right?
You saw a foreshadowing, if you will, of a lot of the issues, oil and gas and environment as a challenge, but you also saw that whole thing about, inept, dishonest. Dave Treen was always supposedly micromanaging government, and we thought that, I remember a clip that we couldn't find.
Well, yeah, that was the famous clip where Edwin Edwards said it took Dave Treen 90 minutes to watch 60 Minutes on television. And it stuck because Edwards had a wonderful way of saying things like that, and they stuck. And that haunted Treen throughout the rest of the election. And even to today, people remember that quip about him.
Absolutely.
And was it true? I don't think so, but he kind of everything that had happened in his administration just kind of fit into that because he liked to study things. He liked to be certain about things. He liked to take his time.
Right.
And Edwards certainly didn't.
Yeah, so it's going into his third term now. And there's a trip to Paris that takes place to pay off some debt, I guess, right?
Right.
You both went.
We did. We both went on that trip, as what did a lot of media. We did not pay $10,000 to go on the trip.
We did not.
So what did the French think of the arrival?
Well, you know, the French have always had, especially Parisians, have always had a fascination for Louisianians. And of course, there was an organization at the time started by a Frenchman named Michel Tauriac, which was called the France-Louisiana Society or Association.
Okay.
And he actually engineered a lot of the things that they did.
Okay.
Just coincidentally, Beth and I had done a joint production the year before where we went to France and did a lot of these things, and so Marion picked our brains about, so did you do this, did you do that? So anyway, we went, and it was a spectacle, and it was successful. It did retire his campaign debt.
I was shocked when I got on the plane and saw Bennett Johnston and his family. So it was friends, family, political opponents.
Right.
It was just a remarkable trip in the sense of they did have a fascination with Louisiana, the Parisians did, and the mayor of Paris had lived in New Orleans for a period of time. Jacques Chirac, at the time he was the mayor.
He was a student of architecture and at Tulane University, and he was a friend of Louisiana. And so he had a meeting with Chirac, he had a meeting with the president of France. I mean, it was a big spectacle, and all the French press was there. And boy, we thought we were bad. Those guys were obnoxious, but it was quite a time. It was a fascinating event, and it was another example of the kind of things that Edwards managed to pull off and pull off successfully.
Yeah, you'll see it was a big deal.
Just last month, these cultural, historical, and business connections between France and Louisiana formed the foundation for an unusual and profitable political event, an event that gained national and international attention.
It's the instructions on how to ride the subway in Paris, and it's compliments of Jack.
Governor-elect Edwin Edwards, fresh from his stunning election victory last October, but nearly $5 million in debt, left New Orleans International Airport January 19th with more than 600 friends and supporters for a trip called A Return to Our Roots. Most of the participants, except for about 100 legislators and a large contingent of reporters, were paying $10,000 each for a ticket on one of the two chartered jumbo jets. The trip, brainchild of Edwards' campaign manager, Brother Marion, was billed as a French pilgrimage, a massive public relations and campaign financing gimmick which used Louisiana's French roots as its draw, and it worked.
But we have over 620 people and no shows, and everybody's happy and having a good time. And I think we'll get to Paris and enjoy ourselves and also have an opportunity to do some serious things.
The group wasn't on French soil more than a couple of hours before Louisiana's Cajun governor was a focus of a solemn ceremony at the historic Arc de Triomphe, where he laid a wreath proclaiming all French and Louisianians cousins.
In the name of Père Marquette, Bienville and Iberville, Cavalier de la Salle, and Louis XIV, who once was our king also, and Lafayette and Foch and de Gaulle, and all the valiant defenders of liberty, equality, and fraternity, from your land and ours, I now lay this wreath and pray that his presence here will forever attest to the friendship, the brotherhood, and the affection between the people of Louisiana and their ancestral home of beautiful France.
Vive la France, vive la Louisiane.
But lest anyone think the entire trip was to be a somber reflection on our French heritage, the next stop for the group offered a stunning contrast. A Louisiana group brought in their first Parisian dawn with dinner and a show at the infamous Lido, letting the bon ton roulé Parisian style. Most of the organizational details for the governor-elect's visit were worked out by the France-Louisiana Association. The group staged a magnificent Parisian feast for the governor and his entourage. It was here that Edwards did something he rarely does: drink, part of a special ceremony inducting the governor-elect and other state officials on the trip into a French wine society, the Compagnon de Beaujolais.
I'll see y'all next week.
Not one Louisiana connection was left unexplored in the governor's return to his roots. Gospel singer John Littleton was a centerpiece of a special mass at the magnificent Cathedral of Notre Dame, where he mixed his Louisiana Baptist upbringing with more traditional French religious music for an interesting, if unusual, Catholic mass.
Everybody with me now. Holy, holy. That's it.
Trip, Edwards proclaimed a childhood desire to become king and said a dinner at Versailles would be a wish fulfilled.
Le gouverneur, c'est l'aubade qui est réservée aux hautes personnalités en présence à Versailles.
Mais ça, c'est magnifique. But listen to that. That's really fantastic. Very few commoners are welcome like that.
One of the chief attractions of Edwards' trip to France was glamour and the proximity to power. Nothing typifies this more than tonight's dinner at Versailles.
But I would have to say that the soul, the heart, the mind, the person that would not have been impressed by the function at the palace at Versailles, just as the person who is cold and unfeeling and cannot be impressed.
The next morning, the group split up, some going to Belgium, others remaining in Paris, and about half of the entourage journeying to the Riviera and the gambling casinos of Monte Carlo.
You know, I spent more time in Notre Dame than I did at the crap table.
Edwards has made no secret of his penchant for gambling and taking risks. In this case, he came out a winner at the dice tables to the tune of $15,000. On his return to Paris, the governor-elect tended to some of the serious business on the trip, meeting with French President Francois Mitterrand and expressing his gratitude for the French involvement in the 1984 World's Fair to be held in New Orleans.
Spent about 25 minutes talking with the president. He was very cordial, and we extended to him and to the people of France an invitation to visit the expo in New Orleans. We thanked him for the participation by the French government for the pavilion which the French people will have there.
We also expressed appreciation for the support they've given us in promoting the French language in Louisiana.
The Edwards trip to France cultivated more interest in Louisiana among French citizens. It was evident that a great deal of interest already exists. That fascination was vividly displayed at the premiere of a new French movie, La Louisiane. The opening of the film was timed to coincide with the Edwards trip. Filmed on location near Baton Rouge, the movie stars Margot Kidder and is an historical drama in the vein of Gone with the Wind. At the premiere party, many in the group confessed they couldn't understand the French dialogue, but enjoyed the musical score by Baton Rouge composer Valerian Smith. On the final day of the visit, a courtesy call to Mayor Jacques Chirac of Paris and an exchange of gifts prompted a round of speeches in French and English. The progress of each day's events was duly recorded by the press, those from Louisiana on the trip, the network television crews in Paris, and reporters from national and international publications. The final press conference of the trip was held at the residence of the American ambassador, where Edwards indicated plans for a new Renault factory to be built in Louisiana were still up in the air.
We visited this afternoon with some of the officials of Renault. Bottom line is no firm decision has yet been made. The only thing firm that I came away with is that the company is definitely committed to the construction of the plant, or a plant, somewhere in America.
If the entire trip mixed business with pleasure, on the eve of the group's departure, the focus was on good times and good food. Dining out at one of the finest restaurants in Paris, Edwards pronounced the trip a success.
Well, it was profitable for the campaign and did raise the money we anticipated, but on the other hand, I think it's going to have continuing dividends for the whole state because meetings with the President of France, the Mayor of Paris, other officials, Renault Corporation, and the goodwill that we have left here, I think is going to serve us well, including, not the least of which, in immediate benefits will be, I think, some stimulated tourism for the World's Expo in New Orleans this year.
Coming back from Paris at that time in 1984, so much promise, but so much that didn't materialize and things took a downturn. We go forward to 1988, and with Edwards, so much was big. And with that, he had his own, say, Camp David of sorts. He had a ranch in Texas. And Beth, you went there to talk to him.
Yes, well, a whole troop of reporters did, because Edwards wanted us to come to diffuse some negative attention.
That's right. There was negative publicity about him selling the ranch and even owning the ranch.
About owning it.
And so he was being asked questions about it at a press conference one day, and he says, well, why don't you all come and see what it is? And so, of course, we did. We all went to the ranch, and he barbecued for us.
And who wouldn't want to do that, right?
Well, it was interesting, but yeah. I felt like we were always saying goodbye to him. Another chapter in his life. And the ranch, I was sort of interested. Why would you want to go to this dried up place where you shot very tiny deer? What you told me they were called something else. I was not your audience. I suppose.
It was his end of that third term, and right. he was bookending it, which he liked to do, and it was once again an opportunity for him to sit down with members of the media and talk about all the wonderful things that he had done.
Good morning. Sorry I'm late. The weather was bad.
This is where Governor Edwin Edwards goes much of the time when he's out of the state and unavailable for comment. He's at the ranch in West Texas Hill Country, about 120 miles from San Antonio. This 1,500-acre spread has about 60 head of cattle, an attractive but modest ranch house, and is currently on the market for $1.6 million. Edwards has owned at one time or another 4 different ranches in Texas. The attraction for Edwards is hunting, something he enjoys doing with friends such as Wayne Ray, an unofficial aide who is currently under federal indictment. Edwards also enjoys being away from the burdens of government and the attention of reporters. But on this day, Edwards issued an open invitation to the media to visit, take pictures, and enjoy some barbecue.
What are you cooking, Governor?
Ribs, chicken, sausage, and brisket. Okay, let's go eat.
Well, it was definitely home on the range with Edwin Edwards at his ranch in Texas, as he was relaxed and reflective, talking with reporters about the highs and lows of his political career. But it was certain that Edwin Edwards, the politician, is not retiring.
I will be practicing law and doing some consulting, and I will be watching the political scene. It's in my blood and part of my life, and while I do not intend to interfere or to try to suggest what should or should not be done. I will watch and see. And as I said 8 years ago when I left, if circumstances change and people are happy with the governor and it appears that he has retained his popularity and served the citizens of the state, I will do what everybody else does. I will applaud and say, thank goodness it happened. If on the other hand it doesn't, then I'm going to take a look at the situation 3 years from now.
Later in the day, Edwards did a series of interviews with reporters and talked about leaving office and his role in Louisiana's history.
Any personal feelings of regret?
Certainly, I'm leaving that which I loved most to do in life, and that is to serve the public. On the other hand, I know that all things come to an end, whether they're good or bad, and it's something that I'm perfectly willing to accept and understand.
Are you afraid that the future generations are going to get a skewed view of Edwin Edwards?
I haven't been warring with the media. I've been defending myself and trying to correct the record and set matters straight. My problems have not been with most of the working press, who by and large are honorable people and do their jobs. I have no concern at all about the truth. As long as the truth is spoken or written, that's fine with me. I'll live and die with it. My concern has been with the publishers and editors of the major newspapers who have tried to mold policy to their own thinking without a real concern for the needs of the people of the state of Louisiana. Having said that, I certainly would not want to be judged 10 years from now or 50 years from now based upon what people read in the newspapers, because it does not accurately portray Edwin Edwards as a man or as a public servant. But third, I console myself when I realized that the press was more antagonistic towards Huey Long at the time he was governor than they've been to me, as bad as they have been to me. Yet people do not remember him for the critical things the press said about him, because then as now they were wrong. He was right and they were wrong. I was criticized when I wanted to keep the Saints in New Orleans. It turned out I was right. I was criticized when I wanted to keep the World's Fair open. It turned out I was right and they were wrong. I was criticized when I wanted to build another bridge in New Orleans. It turned out I was right and they were wrong. I was criticized when I wanted to change the method of collecting taxes on oil by the same people. I was criticized when I advocated a lottery. It turns out sooner or later we're going to have a lottery. It's unfortunate we didn't have it when I first advocated it. We would be a lot better off today. Finally, I certainly would want people to remember me as a person who came from a very humble and poor background and who never forgot his origins, and therefore empathize with and understood and sympathize with other people who are having a hard time making it. I'm talking about single mothers and single fathers who have a difficult time bringing their children up, and those aged people, who 25 to 30,000 of them in nursing homes that are lonely and scared and by themselves and have no one to turn to except the staff at the nursing home to help them get by from day to day and to keep them out of pain and to provide some measure of hope and joy for them in the last years of their life.
Well, on March 14th, when you're no longer governor, the state will have a bond rating worse than Puerto Rico. It'll be $700 million in debt. We'll have the highest unemployment in the country. What do you feel?
Very sad. I see especially sad because it wasn't necessary.
Edwards says he hopes Buddy Roemer succeeds as governor. On the other hand, if he doesn't, Edwards says the people might give him another opportunity. In any case, despite his affection for Western scenery, Edwards will not be riding into the sunset as this political drama ends on March 14th.
So, some people might think a trip to a Texas ranch might be frivolous, but in terms of history and what actually took place, it's very important.
Well, indeed, what I always thought, we had a responsibility to capture the highs and the lows of what was going on. I believed in going to the original documents. I'm an old history teacher, not so old, but at that moment. but therefore, I thought it was very important to have a record of all these events.
And so LPB began its archive system that, that we know now, right?
Actually, we did this as a collaboration because Bob was first assistant secretary of state, and as a commercial broadcaster, he was shocked that we kept film for a long time. But this tape thing made it difficult, right?
So we created the Louisiana Film and Video Archives and began collecting this stuff, and it was interesting because TV stations would just give it to us because they didn't have any place to keep it.
Right.
And then years later, a grant was found, and all these things that we're looking at have been preserved because of the efforts of LPB to keep a record so that we can look at it later.
Right. And I feel so proud that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting gave us a grant to be able to digitize all this, and we have a partnership with the state archives, the only one in the country, like my colleague. I'm on the national board of all this with the Library of Congress. It's Cokie Roberts and I, we're both from Louisiana on it, helping create it. And this is a very, very important thing for us to do, I think. So we've been very diligent at that, and so a good partnership.
It is certainly teaching people who have no idea about certain things what took place, and they can see it visually.
It's right at your fingertips.
Yeah, long about this time, the Edwards political juggernaut hit a pothole with a loss to Buddy Roemer. But Roemer was played out in 4 years, so Edwards stood ready to take on another term if he could get past David Duke, the former wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. They debated. That took place here in these LPB studios. And what happened here kind of changed the political climate in the state.
It was, I will just say this, there are a lot of people that think that Edwards engineered the runoff with David Duke. I don't know that it was that masterful, but it was the perfect runoff for him to be in because he probably couldn't have beaten anybody else. But he did actually shine once again in contrast to David Duke, but it was a scary time too. And I remember that night of the debate, I was here.
I asked you to come to help me.
I was Assistant Secretary of State at the time, but I came to kind of be, because I am a large guy, to kind of be in the front lobby because there was a huge crowd showed up.
Yeah,
and it was kind of scary.
Yeah.
As a newfound Christian, a born again, are you here willing now to apologize to the people, the minorities of this state, whom you have so dastardly insulted, sir?
Mr. Duke, you have 30 seconds. 30 seconds? Of course I apologize for things that I've said that have been intolerant and improper.
Do you repudiate the Klan
and I do
and the
repudiate the Klan
neo-Nazi?
or any other racist organization or intolerant organization that exists in the state or this country. I think we've all got to work together. But you don't make up for past discrimination by putting new discrimination on people with these affirmative action programs and policies. And there's a lot of racism that exists in all communities, not just the white community. There's violence in our streets every day directed against white people as well as the other way around. And this
as well as black people, as well as against black people?
Look, Mr. Robinson, I don't think you're really being fair with me.
I don't think you're really being honest, sir.
Well, you're not, you know, you're doing the debate here, aren't you? You're not asking questions. You're here to put me down, and that's your prerogative.
Mr. Edwards, 30 seconds.
It's interesting that in Texas and in Iowa, I think it is, the Klan people there have already announced that they're coming down here to help their friend, Mr. Duke. If they come, I hope they behave themselves, because I met with the sheriffs today and told them to be on the lookout. If any of them intimidate anybody or get in the way or try to interfere with the election process, they're going to be dealt with harshly. Let me say this. Mr. Duke has given us 20 years of hate and hurt. If he's really reformed, let him go back into the community and give us 20 years of healing and help. Then come back and ask to be governor. Let's go back now to the issues. This man has attacked us for 20 years. Now all of a sudden he wants to stop the attacks. While David Duke was burning crosses and scaring people, I was building hospitals to heal them. When he was parading around in a Nazi uniform to intimidate our citizens, I was in a National Guard uniform bringing relief to flood and hurricane victims. When he was selling Nazi hate literature as late as 1989 in his legislative office, I was providing free textbooks for the children of this state. When he was writing porno books, I was signing anti-pornographic legislation. I have been in this business for a long time. I have a record, and he has a record. I suggest to you he's given us 20 years of hate and hurt, and I don't think he's earned the right to ask you to be governor. Let him go back to our communities if in fact he has a newfound religion. And let him spend some time providing some healing and some help to overcome what he has done to us for all these years, given us this reputation in the nation and in the rest of the world. Then after he has done community service and served mankind with some help Then let him come back to us 20 years from now when he has matured and truly shown us that he is a different, new person. Maybe at that time we'll think about letting him be governor of our state. But until then, don't let him divide us. Don't let him separate us from the rest of the nation. Don't let him make a mockery of Louisiana. We're too important and we're too good for that. The people of this state need a governor as good as the people of this state, not someone whose reputation, deserved or not, around the nation is one of hate and division. I don't want my Louisiana to fall into that morass. We went down that road one time a long time ago, and we suffered for it for many decades. We'll not let David Duke take us down that same road again. Not ever.
So as governor, 4 terms, never-ending investigations, and finally a conviction and off to prison. It looked like the end of the line for Edwin Edwards, but he came out renewed and with a new wife, Trina Scott, 51 years his junior. And in 2014, at an Edwards roast, the dry humor of the governor was on full display. This was in Monroe at the Civic Center to raise money for the Chenault Air Museum.
Governor,
these fellas up here are all my friends. Well, some of them. Robert Adley. He is also a part-time preacher, as you know, and a great man. One time he asked, when he was a kid, asked God for a bike. He didn't get it, so he stole one and asked for forgiveness. Now you look at Robert and you think he's ugly. You should have seen him when he was a baby. His mother used to borrow a baby to go to church. I remember the letter you sent me, Robert, when I was in prison, and I remember what I wrote back. Wish you were here. Robert Barham. Very smart man. I asked him one time if he knew who Johnny Cash was. He said, yeah, it's a pay toilet. Robert, if I ever agree with you, we'll both be wrong. Well, Roma, Governor Roma, you know, I see you sitting there like you somebody important. And I might be a great politician, but you're a hell of an actor. I want to thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it very much. Trina and I have been around the state in various places about 50 times since my vacation. I moved into a golfing community so I could play golf, and I played one time. I'm so busy, and I really mean that. I sometimes feel like going back to prison so I can rest.
So he is joking about going back to prison. People laugh, embrace, love him, but just wouldn't vote for him.
That's right. He was still loved and beloved by many people and still very entertaining. He could always turn a phrase, but he was no longer electable, and that showed when he attempted to run for Congress in the 6th Congressional District. You know, his days of winning elections were long over, and the damage had been done. But he was still Edwin Edwards, the guy that we came to know and love in the beginning, I guess you would say. Yeah. He was still interesting to the media.
And I guess one of the things I know about him is you always felt like he was genuine when he was talking to you. You also thought, this is a man who's so smart. If he only would take all of these attributes and focus them on good, imagine how wonderful he would be as governor. I think he could do that 4 times. But then his time was up doing that.
Yeah. He did tell us in an interview prior to his 4th term that this was going to be the term that he was going to right all the wrongs and just be governor. And of course that didn't work out.
The last thing he ever said to me was, I was at Lieutenant Governor Bobby Freeman's funeral across the river, and Edwin was there. and he wanted me to meet his little son, who was, 6 years old. And he said, "Come meet my son." He was so proud of him.
Yeah,
I
he
thought
was
that
very
was so
proud.
interesting. Right.
Well, in December of 2019, there was a report that Edwin Edwards was gravely ill. Turned out not to be true, even though it did make the wires. But it did spur us at LPB to request a hurried sit-down interview with him, and he said yes. So as we sat down, he asked me, "What's the reason for this?" And I said, "We figured that you're not going to always be here, and we wanted to hear from you before that would happen." So one of the last, if not the last, sit-down interviews with Edwin Edwards, as candid as ever, and it's never been seen before. What's the most proud moment of your life?
Well, of course, having my children is very important, and especially my youngest one, Eli, who's now 6 years old. But I've had many, many great advantages in my life.
Name a few of the top ones.
Well, I finished law school when I was 21 years old in 1949. I was very proud of that. I grew up on a farm with my father, who had a third grade education and was a sharecropper. My mother was a lady who had a seventh grade education, and she was a self-taught midwife who delivered over 1,800 children in her life. I'm very proud of that. And of course, the fact that I'm the only four-term governor is something that I appreciate very much.
Were you close to your parents?
Oh, very close. I had a very close relationship.
And your brothers and sisters?
They're all dead.
All dead.
I had a sister and 3 brothers, and they're all gone.
You've outlived all of them.
That's right.
Well, you
Very close. We were a very close family.
Yeah, we are too. That's
good. That's the Cajun of Orleans Parish tradition.
You're described as colorful, powerful, legendary. Is that accurate?
Well, I certainly wouldn't argue with that. I appreciate it.
Yeah. As governor, the most important thing that you did, what would you say?
Probably writing the new Constitution in the 1970s. That was very important and still serving us well today after all these years. From a standpoint of finances, changing the method by which we collect taxes on oil and gas is very important. When I became governor, we were getting 25 cents a barrel for the production of oil. I changed that to percentage of value, but the natural gas went to 7 cents a thousand cubic feet, and that brought billions of dollars into the state, 65% of which was paid by other states using our natural resources. And then, of course, the building of the Superdome is the monument of physical assets that I'm responsible for.
Early in your career, you thought you might be a preacher?
Well, I wanted to be a country and western singer, but I didn't have any talent.
No? Oh, really?
Only my mother thought I could sing. Okay. And then for a little while, when I was a teenager, I was a member of the Nazarene Church, and I was a youth minister. But I gave that up and decided to try something else. And I didn't have enough money to go into business when I graduated from high school. So I went to college, wanted to get an education so I could find something to do without having a big investment. And that's why I went to LSU. Then I went to the Navy when I was 17 years old and served there as a pilot. But I didn't have to fight because the war ended before that happened. But then I came back and went to law school and finished when I was 21 years old in 1949.
That's really young.
And I started practicing law in Crowley, and I ran for the city council, won 2 terms. Then I decided to run for the state senate, won that, and then I went to Congress for 4 terms, and then governor for 4 terms.
Preacher versus politician. What is it about politics that was really your thing?
In my opinion, the ability to serve people and to make things happen, which is what I liked.
And you did?
Yeah.
What would you do if you were governor now? As you look around the state?
I'd cry a lot.
You would cry a lot?
Yeah.
If you were governor now, you'd cry a lot?
It's hard to deal with the legislature now.
Yeah.
There's a great deal of, I don't like what's happening in Washington or here because there's too much acrimony between parties. And it's not a question of Democrat or Republican, it's what's good for the people. And too many times that doesn't come out first.
All you get is Democrat or Republican, and the gulf is wide.
Wide. And what one group wants, the other group doesn't want automatically. Bad.
So how would you deal with that if you were in that position again? Could you?
Well, I don't know what the answer to that is, but one thing is, two things. One, redistricting is bad because now the legislatures have made districts where they serve one section and leave everybody out. And it's better if you got a district where the legislator represents blacks and whites, liberals and conservatives, because then he has to address everything. But now, some legislators have nothing but Republicans, conservative Republicans. Some have only liberal Democrats, and they don't seem to care about the rest, and that's not good.
Was governor your favorite political role?
Yes, well, because it gave me an opportunity to do things, and I like that.
Right.
I was in Congress and in the state legislature, but things moved too slow.
How do you rate some of the governors of the past? Which ones do you remember as the ones who did good for the people versus maybe were not effective?
Every one of them had challenges to meet. The two that I think did the worst were Jindal and Roma. But they did what they could at the time, but I'm not going to criticize them because I was in prison most of the time when they were governor, so I don't know what the problems were, but Jindal, I think, just was a horrible governor. He spent all of his time running for president.
You mentioned prison. What else did you do?
Well, I did. I had a lot of correspondence. People wrote me, and I had to write them back. And I also did a lot of exercising, trying to keep healthy. But I spent a lot of time. I was the chief librarian. And I spent a lot of time helping some other inmates who didn't have any education get a GED.
How do you look back at those days?
In my long life, it's the only really unfair thing that ever happened to me. The whole thing was a disaster, ill-conceived, an effort by the part of overzealous prosecutors and a biased judge. They tried me 4 times. And when I had a fair judge, they couldn't get any votes. But this judge was so bent on getting me convicted that when he found out people on the jury were trying to acquit me, he identified one of them and kicked him off the jury. And he allowed 11 people out of the jury pool to convict me. The only time in American history, in the federal system, that a person was convicted of a major crime with less than a 12% vote. But it was done, and I had to live with it, and I did. I survived.
You survived.
Everything has a good thing. If it were not for the fact that they sent me to prison, I would never have met Trina, and I wouldn't have a baby named Eli, who's my pride and joy. And by the way, the judge is dead, and the prosecutors all had to resign in embarrassment for things they did after they convicted me.
What is something about Edwin Edwards that most people don't know about?
I don't know, but...
Because most people will say they know you, but no one ever knows.
Well, I'm a very complex person.
Yeah.
I have multiple phases of my life, but I like to tell people honestly that I live to help other people, and I feel a great deal of satisfaction helping somebody. This morning I went to give blood in a blood test, and the nurse, who's about 50 years old, told me, she said, you don't remember me, but when I was 14 years old, I worked for a person that was selling fireworks. And we opened before the season, and we were told not to open the doors, and she made me open them anyhow. And a deputy sheriff came and arrested me and handcuffed me. and he said, you were governor at the time, and for some reason you came into the lot and saw what was happening. You talked to the officer, and he let me go. I'll never forget that. Now, that's 40 years ago. But every day I meet somebody that I helped that I don't remember anything about, but I'm glad I did. Can you imagine 14 years old being put in handcuffs?
14, yeah. Tell me about your faith.
I've gone through a metamorphosis, I guess. I was a youth minister and very involved in that. I was born and reared a Catholic, but we lived way out in the country and we were poor people and we couldn't go to church, so I never got very much into the Catholic religion. But then when I married Elaine, I reestablished my Catholicism, but then after a while we got away from it. And right now I really don't get much, I don't know what my faith is. I'm not quite sure about anything, and so I try not to tell people what to do.
Okay. What do you tell yourself to do?
I'm very confident with my life. I never cheated anybody. In my whole life, I never had a fist fight. Never hit anybody. And I never deliberately hurt anybody. And I feel very good about that. And I tell myself, just behave yourself, take care of other people, and do what you can to make life better for other people. And that's what I do.
How do you want people to remember you?
As someone who cared. Just like that.
Simple as that.
Simple as that. I cared. And you know, I never forgot where I came from. I know what it's like to be poor and worrying about the future. And I try to help people to make their life more pleasant. I'm very lucky. I'm 92 and a half years old. I have all my teeth. I can read and write and drive without glasses. I sleep well at night, eat what I want. I'm very blessed.
I'm blessed to be able to talk to you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good.
I appreciate it. To see more of my full interview with Edwin Edwards, go to ladigitalmedia.org. You'll find the interview plus full-length clips of the videos you've seen tonight, and there is much more that we didn't have time to bring you in this special broadcast. It's a virtual treasure trove of Louisiana's history. And Bob and Beth, thank you so much for your unique insights in being there.
Well, it was great to be here, and I would sum everything up about Edwin Edwards from a personal viewpoint is that he was probably, or is, the most charismatic, confusing, and sometimes confounding people that I ever covered as a journalist.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Sure appreciate it. And thank you for being with us. I'm André Moreau at LPB's studios in Baton Rouge. Good night and stay safe.